They're dead, Dave.
What, Captain Hollister?
Everybody's dead, Dave.
What, Todd Hunter? What, Selby? Not Jen.
He's dead, Dave. Everybody is dead. Everybody is dead, Dave.
Hello, welcome to Everybody is Dead Dave, the Red Dwarf review podcast hosted by myself, Phil Hawkins, and my co-host, Adam Martyn, the relative newbie of the two of us. And we usually, if you're new here, go through every episode of Red Dwarf. We are currently up to the Back to Earth, part 3 we've just done. The debut on Dave, the channel, after 10 years away. Then we're launched into a new era. But before we go into the Dave era proper with the Series 10, Series 11, Series 12, when they got back to proper series again, we're going to take a few more specials, take a bit of time to do a few more specials and look at some more auxiliary stuff around the edges of Red Dwarf. And one of those things is the Smegazine.
Yes, that's right. The official magazine companion of Red Dwarf, if you like. Because it seems... It definitely, well, it's not. I would argue it's not so much a trend anymore. I think the world's moved on, but certainly, would you agree, Phil? In like the 90s, 2000s, it seemed if you had a hit TV show that was ongoing, you kind of had to have a magazine to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't have a magazine to go with your TV show, you weren't a hit TV show. Clearly. I remember buying magazines. So obviously, there's Doctor Who magazine, which is like the top tier of tie-in magazines that has been going for so many years now. What, since
40
the 70s?
plus years now.
Yeah. And like no other tie-in magazine can rival that. In the past I've bought a few issues of various Star Trek tie-in magazines. There's obviously, I never bought this, but there's obviously this. I had some Buffy the Vampire Slayer magazines back in the day, but all of them kind of just, other than Doctor Who magazine, all of them just lasted like maybe a year or two and then fizzled out.
Yeah, like sort of through the peak of their show's popularity, perhaps, and then they just sort of, as you say, they fade away. I mean, how do we know how long this magazine went on for?
This one, I think it was about 2 years. So it was 14 issues for volume 1 and 9 issues for volume 2. So if they were monthly, that's about roughly just over 2 years.
Yeah.
Farewell issue was published, labelled Volume 2, Issue 9, and cover dated January 1994. So, it was launched in 1992. So, about 2 years.
I suppose that tracks out in the sense that after, of course, Series 6 in 1993, Red Dwarf did stop for a few years. So maybe they felt there wasn't as much and some might say, but Doctor Who magazine carried on. But you forget, when Doctor Who went off the air, they had 26 years worth of content to draw from, whereas when Red Dwarf paused, they only had about, 5 years?
Yeah, so, I mean, there's only so much behind-the-scenes sort of stuff you can do, really, isn't there, when you've only got sort of 6 series to work with. And then, obviously, there's the comic, and the comic is what we're going to be talking about today. We're not going to delve massively into the kind of other stuff that was in the magazine. I should say that the... part of the reason we're able to do this is one of our listeners on Twitter, TC, has sent us the scans of the first sort of comic arc, which is called The End. It is the comic version of that. It is exactly
what you think
story.
It is.
Yep. So it's basically it's a comic interpretation of the first sort of episode, basically.
Yeah.
And it was over 3 parts. So thank you, TC, for sending that.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's proven very handy because we were a bit stuck on what to do for today's recording, weren't we? We were like, we want to do some more specials, but a couple of the things we were planning on doing, we can't do quite yet because I haven't finished reading the novel. And we had another idea of something to do with the DVDs, and then I realized I don't actually own the DVDs of series 1 and 2. So we're doing this instead, basically.
We are.
And
so thank you, TC. You've come in clutch for us there.
Yeah.
So much appreciated.
Helped us out at the last minute there. We literally decided to do this yesterday, I think.
We did.
So, I mean, they have the kind of behind the scenes articles, interviews with the cast. In these first issues, there's interviews with Chris Barry, and an article called Holly's Amazing Facts.
It's like a lot of, I guess, what you call, not in any way disrespectful, like standard magazine fare. Like you've got the mail-in pages where Holly answers them in one of the issues. Like say you've got the fun page where it's like riddles or quizzes or questions, and details of. I think the first one they preview series 5 because of course that was up and coming at the time, and in another one they talk about Red Dwarf series 2 coming out on video. Did it really take, just to touch on that quickly, did it really take that long? Because if this was 1992, series 2 was in 1988, so did it really take the BBC that long to put these out on video?
I think it did, because if you think about VHSs, I don't think they really massively took off until the very late 80s. So I think a lot of places were, like, in terms of commercial release per home video, obviously the technology existed, but it was very unaffordable, as new technology tends to be for a while. So it was probably around about this time, the sort of very early 90s, that VHSs just became affordable for everyone to buy more than just the occasional one.
Yeah, and in the preview for Series 2 on video, they do that classic 90s VHS tape thing where, obviously due to the limitations of the format, they couldn't put all 6 episodes on one tape. But instead of, there was 2 tapes, but instead of labeling it Series 2 Part 1 or Part 2, they do that 90s thing of, they just call it whatever the first episode is. And do you know what I mean? So it's like Red Dwarf 2, Crichton. And then the second one is Red Dwarf 2, Stasis Leak. And obviously, I believe it has like the other episodes on there as well. But I just love that. They don't go for Part 1 or Part 2. They just label it the first. Loads of TV shows did that back in the day, I remember. But yeah, so it's got a lot of that magazine fare, really. So I guess the comic strip was the main unique draw for this one then, surely, to see these stories sort of be reimagined as comics, or even sort of like, you could maybe say a graphic novel sort of style, perhaps, if that was it. But obviously it's part of a magazine.
Yeah. And one thing I will, we can talk about different aspects of this. It's going to be a bit of different. We're not going to go through it beat by beat, because it's the same story as the first episode, which you've already heard us talk about. So you know our thoughts on the structure of the episode and the story itself, what we think of the story, because we've talked about it already. And one thing to say about this is it is a pretty spot on, unlike the novel, a faithful recreation of that first story. It's not something that they've reinterpreted a lot of stuff in.
No, I suppose if you want the most faithful recreation outside of watching the actual episode, then this comic is probably the way to go, as opposed to the book, which offers you, as you say, a different, more expanded, slanted interpretation, you could argue. So yeah, something for everyone. And I guess to launch a magazine, maybe it made sense starting with just adapting the first episode.
I suppose so. I suppose for anybody that, well, I was going to say for anybody that has not seen the show, it then gives you the background, I suppose. Because they did go on to do original stories in the comic. They did this, then they did an adaptation of Future Echoes, then they did some original stories as well. So I guess it was to kind of get that grounding, maybe. Although it does make me wonder, who would buy this magazine if you haven't seen the show and are familiar with the show? You probably wouldn't.
I suppose so. I guess some would say maybe it's that thing kids do sometimes, like, when you're at a shop with your parents or something and you down the magazine aisle and you see, and it's the cover that, because let's face it, when I was looking through these, the covers of these magazines look great. It's all original art, isn't it? Of like the crew, and like in issue 1, it's the main 4, and there's Hattie's head as Holly in the sky. Do you know what I mean? It's very enticing artwork. Yeah. So I could maybe say, if I was a kid back in 1992, and maybe if I hadn't seen Red Dwarf, or maybe I'd heard about it from friends but never watched it, maybe a cover like that would have piqued my interest. But like you say, maybe. I think, the vast majority of the readership are going to be people who know what Red Dwarf is, and probably, I'm sure they enjoyed this adaptation, but I'm sure they maybe didn't spend a long time on it, because they knew the story.
Yeah, and maybe one day we'll get around to covering some of these original comics as well that came up, because that does sound kind of slightly more interesting to me anyway, because it's something it's a story I haven't seen, and I've always had this kind of like with Doctor Who. I was never massively. I never felt a draw to read the Target novelizations, because I was like, well, I would rather read an original novel than just a novelization of a TV episode I've already seen. So I got a kind of similar feeling here. It's kind of like, well, it's nice, but it's it's still the same old story. So to read some of those original ones would be good. We don't currently have the scans of those, but if we get hold of them at any point, I'm sure we'll do some episodes. There's a whole load of like original, just basic Red Dwarf ones, but then there's kind of like some spin-off ones as well. There's Ace Rimmer, Space Adventurer, so more of Ace Rimmer. I'm really interested in seeing those if we can get hold of those. The Amusing Misadventures of Mr. Flibble.
Now that's got my interest.
And there's 5 of those stories, so I'm really looking forward to seeing those at some point. And then there's, can you remember the Australian android soap opera androids? Yes,
I do.
Oh yes, there's 20.
I know. I'm just looking at the list. There's quite a lot of those.
Yep. Dwayne Dibley has his own comic in this.
He does.
Gelf
World.
Jake Bullitt, who is of course Crichton's character in the kind of back to reality VR world. Well, when they've been affected by the despair squid, isn't it? But that's his character from that kind of imaginary world. The 2 Inquisitor stories. The Scutters get their own story as well.
They do.
And looking right at the bottom of this wiki page, there is apparently a comic strip for the Red Dwarf USA, which we haven't watched yet, but we're going to do a special on that at some point as well.
I know. And funnily enough, in one of these magazines, I believe it's issue 2, there's actually one of the articles is Red Dwarf USA saying, oh, how exciting, like following in the footsteps of all these other programs that, went stateside. There's a special US version of Red Dwarf being made. It's currently at the pilot stage. And I'm like, right.
And it won't be getting any further.
It won't be going any further than that, and probably will never be touched upon in the magazine ever again.
Yeah.
But, so, interesting bit of Red Dwarf history in there to dive into.
So if you have scans of any of these other comics that came later, do let us know. But we are just covering the end today. So,
or if you have them in your attic and you feel like donating them, then we will happily receive them
Get
and
in
read
contact
them.
On Twitter at
Please do.
AllDeadDavePod. So what do you think about the art style of this then? Let's talk a bit about the art style.
In general, it's very well drawn, as comic book art, because I guess computers existed then, didn't they? But I think I'd argue in the early 90s, especially for like UK TV time magazines, I think 90%, if not all of the art for comics was still very much a hand-drawn thing. You're traditional, very traditional, where you'd maybe pencil everything, then put all the colours in. But the general drawing of it, I really like. You can tell who each character is, the settings are very clear and all that sort of stuff. The main thing for me was that obviously most of it adopts colour-wise like this red, orange, yellow hue, like
I was
going
to say that it's very dark in that regards because of the colours they've chosen to use. It's very stylized.
Yes.
I quite like it, but it is very dark.
It is. I think there's some shots in the overall comic, like the very first panel of issue 1. So you've got a shot of Red Dwarfs on the left. You've got what looks like Saturn in the middle, and like this fiery galaxy and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? The very first panel, and then there's like space around it as well. I think that looks really nice with this color scheme. But then I think there are others where it just, like the orange or yellow, just dominates the panel so much that it feels very washed out in that sense. Like there's not much room for other detail. Because I guess orange, I'm not an artist, by the way, so I'm not proclaiming to know what I'm talking about. But to me, the orange and yellow are quite dominating colours. Do you know what I mean? Like if they fill a lot of a page, that is the dominant colour. It's hard for other colours, I think, to like make their way in. And there's just a few of those panels where I'm like, it'd be nice if, like, where are the blues? Where are your greens? Where are you? Because Red Dwarf itself, I know we not derided. We had a go at series 1 and 2 for being very grey in the corridors, that very BBC studio grey. But especially from series 3 onwards, there's a lot more colour within like the Red Dwarf ship itself. So it would have been nice to have seen a bit more of that. But I mean, the stylizations go. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's very hit or miss depending on the I think you're right.
Where I think it really doesn't work as well is where it's I think there's the captain's office, so where Lister is being accused of having the cat, and where's the cat rimmer, all that sort of stuff. They're very, it's all orange, but this would surely be a well lit room. It looks like they're all in shadow. It just doesn't, it looks a bit strange.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, I think that's what I mean by like the hit or miss nature of it. There's panels of it that really were like, I think anything that shows like space or like the Red Dwarf ship itself, things where, you know, they were originally that color, like red or orange, and then there's bits to enhance it. But yeah, I mean, as I say, on the whole, I wouldn't say it's a bad art style or choice to take, but I just think it's a very like hit or miss one. And I wonder if, because obviously the end, these three parts, it keeps that throughout, doesn't it? It doesn't deviate from that. So I wonder in the future adaptations, or if in the original ones, if they continue that red, orange, yellow sort of color hue, or if they if they branch out, or did they eventually go to just black and white? Because that was still a thing, I think, in the early 90s. I remember reading some Doctor Who magazines from that era, the early 90s, and a lot of those comics are still in black and white, you know, whether it's for budget reasons or otherwise.
They are, and I think despite having some misgivings about this overall orange hues, I think I would prefer it to black and white. I've never gotten on with black and white comics for some
Have
reason.
you not? Not a fan?
I find them hard to focus on, draw my attention to where I'm meant to look. I think I find them quite busy, and I've always found them difficult to keep my attention, even when the story is good. So I just kind of really struggled to. I don't know what that's just the way my brain works or something, but it just really struggled. So all those early Doctor Who ones, I really struggled to read. And when I think it was IDW did colorized versions of those comics, about 10 or so years ago, maybe a few more, maybe 15 years ago, I read them, some of them for the first time, and some of them like attempting for the second time, and actually got through them. And that really helped. So I think I would definitely prefer this to black and white.
Oh, I would too. Yeah, I think Red Dwarf shouldn't be constrained by the monochrome tones, as lovely as they can be. One small difference I think I noticed in this adaptation is how Holly's depicted. Not necessarily in terms of what he says, because like you said, the actual dialogue, if you like, and the progression of events is very much what happens in the episode.
I mean, the dialogue's like almost it is word for word the same.
Yeah,
there might be some lines missed out or something, but there's not really anything that's not in the episode.
No, it's a very solid adaptation in that sense. But Holly, from a design perspective, like his face is depicted. There's one great panel where his face is like the dominant thing. I think it's when he says 3 million years, you know, after Dave comes out of the stasis leak. His face is like portrayed to be like more angular, sort of in a way like what Crichton's is in the show. Not to the same degree, but you know what I mean? Like his cheeks especially look more angular and like around his head. He's been given, I think, like a slightly different hairstyle as well. He's got like a bit at the top of his head in the middle, and then two sort of hanging bit. And I don't remember Norman Lovett having that hairstyle in series 1. I mean,
no.
I could.
Well,
be
he
wrong.
didn't. I think he had the side bits, and then bald on top.
Well, did they hang off like they do in this? They sort of, you know.
Yeah, they're more exaggerated here, I think.
Yeah. I think that's the word to use. They've exaggerated Holly's, and I don't think it's bad. I think in terms of him obviously being, yes, he's got a personality, but at his heart, he's still like a computer program. I think the looks all right. I just found it interesting that they decided to go for that, and I wonder if eventually, if these comics started including Hattie's version of Holly, I wonder if she got a similar treatment. Like, is her face more angular, or is it just presented as was? I mean, what did you think? Were there any sort of minor changes or little things you picked up on? Or
well, Captain Hollister is looks different. I'd say he looks quite different from how he looked in the episode. His kind of just whole face it looks like a different character. Pachansky has similarities, but she kind of looks different as well. She's got bigger hair here, I think.
She's blonde, isn't she, in the comic?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, she wasn't blonde.
Yeah. Or maybe that's just the yellow hue, I don't know. But yeah, I'm pretty sure the original Kachansky had brown hair. But
yeah.
Because when I first read that bit in the comic, at first I was like, who's this? But then it's the panel where there's like the love hearts around Lister and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, right, is this... Because I don't think she's actually mentioned by... Not in that page, maybe somewhere else. But I don't think she's actually mentioned by name in in that page.
Not when he's interacting with her, no.
No,
but then,
maybe later
like,
on.
A reference to her later that he wanted to take her to Fiji, and it is the same character in he imagines it, and it's the same character. So that is clearly still Kochanski.
That's Kochanski, a blonde Kochanski.
The uniforms, interestingly, are more in line. They've drawn them more in line with what Rimmer's uniform is in series sort of 3 and 4.
Yeah. I guess maybe they thought if they knew they were going to do more stories, it was best to have like one consistent look to the uniform as opposed to it changing as it did in the show, perhaps. Because if this was around series 5, maybe
that makes sense. Yeah, and also. One thing they did change, they didn't like we said, they didn't change much at all other than the looks of things. We've obviously got they've taken advantage of the medium to make the ship feel bigger. So you've got huge rooms that they just did not have the budget to create on TV. And gaping spaces and like huge windows that look out to fantastical things in space that you can see in the background and things like that. But also, one actual plot change is that in this version, holograms appear as completely grey.
Yes, I must admit I quite like that addition. That because it sort of gives the impression, that whole thing of their presence is there, but it's sort of lifeless. The original life isn't there; it's merely a hologram. Because I guess holograms in comics are often depicted in that sort of one tone, aren't they? Like I've seen in comics where it's either like blue or white or grey. So I quite like the artistic choice of that personally. It surprised me at first, and again, I wonder if they're going to be consistent with it because, of course, in this adaptation of the end, like you say, Rimmer, when he does become a hologram, is presented in that greyed out style. So again, I wonder if in future comics with Rimmer, are they going to be are they going to stay consistent and stick with that, or is it going to be a thing that just gets forgotten about? I suppose.
Yeah. Well, one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about the fact that they are going to do original comics is that apparently, from what I've read, do correct me if I'm wrong in the comments of the YouTube version of this if you know otherwise, but they're not all set in the same continuity. There are some of these comics which apparently follow on from the continuity of the novels.
Right.
Which is also quite interesting. I don't know which ones they are at the moment. Maybe we should hold off on those until we finish the novels. And of course, even the novels have multiple continuities. We've got the ones that we're reading at the moment, the 2 that are set, but then later novels are in a different continuity again. There's a whole multiverse of
a Red Dwarf multiverse.
The Red Dwarf multiverse. One thing I did want to draw attention to was one bit of imagery that was in one of the issues where Dave is talking about his Fiji plan, and Rimmer is picking holes in it a bit, and they're pointing out that Fiji is flooded since the volcano went off, and it's like 3 feet underwater or something like that. And, and of course, Dave wants to create a farm there, so he's like, "What are you going to do? What are you going to do with the sheep? Buy them water wings, fit them with stilts, crossbreed them with dolphins." And what the comic, that's a line from the show. But what the comic has done is it's visualized that. So you get actually a panel with sheep that are on stilts, a half sheep, half dolphin thing. And it's amusing. And the one on stilts is kind of giving this kind of like amusing waving to the sort of audience.
Yes. No, I feel like you said about some of the other aspects, that's taken advantage of the comic medium, really, isn't it? Making those ideas a reality. And I think, obviously, I know you say they do Future Echoes, and that's the only other TV story they adapt, I think.
I believe so, yeah.
But it makes you wonder, like, there's so many lines throughout those first few series, mainly from Rimmer, where he says things like that, things that conjure up such imagery, and it makes you think, if only we could see more of that. I guess that's what, like, it's sort of vision or giving an interpretation. It's like when you read books, like when we've read the Red Dwarf novels, I think we said in our first review of Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers that, when it talks about, Lister's life before Red Dwarf, what he has to do and like where he sleeps in a locker, all that sort of stuff. That's you in your head. It's almost like an author's read that and then scribbled it onto a comic book page, and it's great to see, because I can't draw, so it's nice to see an interpretation of that sort of scenario.
Another thing that they've taken from later series and sort of visually and incorporated it into this story where it wasn't before is I noticed the quarters look very much like their series 3 and 4 and 5 quarters as well. They kind of start the more white quarters rather than that gunmetal grey, and the paneling on the walls is that kind of color as well.
That's it. It's almost like they've taken the elements. You could say improved, each to everyone's taste, but you could say improved from series 1 and 2 in terms of like the vastness of the ship and the more detail. And it's almost like they've just inserted that into the, which I kind of like, because even though we say it's a 1-to-1 adaptation or near enough of the script, I like the fact they didn't necessarily go the same with the visuals. You know what I mean? Like they weren't just drawing from, screen grabs or photos of series 1. They thought, right, we'll depict these characters as they were, but we want to do it our way, where we expand the ship, we keep elements of the current series that we like. Do you know what I mean? And I think keeping those elements doesn't detract from what the end is as a story, because a lot of them are cosmetic rather than part of the plot.
Yeah,
as it were.
Yeah, definitely. What did you think of Kat's entrance?
I loved it. I think Kat's so. I love the way Kat's drawn in this. I actually think out of the characters we've seen thus far, in those 3 issues, I think Kat personally looks the best out of the 3 of them. I don't know about you, but just there's that panel where he emerges from the vent and he says, "How am I looking?" It's a great standing pose of the Kat character, and he's got that red jacket and his waistcoat and his high boots and stuff. I think he looks really great. I love the entrance of it.
Yeah, and talking of the entrance, I really liked that first panel before you even see him properly revealed. They ramp up the kind of creepiness of it because they having the vent being pushed open, and then you see the blackness of the vent with just the eyes, the mouth with the fangs, and like a clawed hand coming out. So, we know it's the cat, and we know the cat's friendly, but at that moment, it's a very menacing image.
Yes, yeah, and I love that. And there's a similar moment when Lister comes out of stasis, and it's the funny bit in when he picks up the powder and says, "What's this?" as he eats it, and Holly says, "Oh, that's it's like that was the cook," or something like that. They do that here, but the panel where he realizes is drawn in a very like creepy way as well, where it's sort of Lister's. You can only see Lister's eyes and his mouth. The rest of his face isn't like drawn in, if you get me. And,
right. Yeah.
It's like a look of horror. It's just it's similar way, I guess, to the cat in the vent thing. But yeah, I like the fact we're seeing these different art styles that maybe you wouldn't necessarily pin to Red Dwarf. Because I think if you'd asked me what would a Red Dwarf comic look like, I don't think I would have pictured this. Not in a bad way, but I think it's very, like I said, it's very artistic. It's very stylistic as well, for good or for worse. Because it depends as well. If even in some of the originals, if this style is the style, then I think for the original stories, they'd have to cater to that, in terms of like the planets they land on or the people they meet. Because like, say, if you were on a water planet and it's all, I don't know, all yellow, it just, I don't know.
Yeah.
That'd mess my eyes up, I think. But
yeah. And I think it is the scenes. If you look at the scenes where, for instance, they're like, when he's imagining on Fiji, that doesn't have that much of the hue. It's got a very different color to it. You got the blue sky and the water and the trees and things. I think it's still a little. It's a little bit orangey red, but I think maybe like off the ship. I'm expecting that they might involve some other colors based on that. But
yeah, or maybe like saying these original adventures, if they're supposedly different continuities or different universes, maybe the art style changes.
Yeah, and might not be the same artist for every story either. So the artwork on this one was a guy called Alan Burrows. Might not be him for the next story. Might not be him for future Echoes. In which case, we might see visual changes in how they look and things. I thought the likenesses were a bit mixed. I think on some of the close-ups where they obviously put in more effort, they are quite good. Particularly, there's one of Kat, which is really good. Looks very much like it's after that one that you mentioned, where it's more of just a close up of his face, and that looks. He's pulling a kind of weird, kind of snarly look, and it does look a lot like the character from the TV show. But then there's other times when, especially with Rimmer, where depending on the angle, I think it's depending on the angle of where he's looking. Sometimes it looks more like him, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess drawing people who obviously exist, it must be such a hard job for any artist.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I know I couldn't do it, and I think for me, as long as I can clearly see who that character's meant to be, even if it doesn't 100% look like them, for me, I can sort of look past it.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people can't, which is fair enough. But yeah, that must be hard though, isn't it? Because I guess back then as well, the internet wasn't really a thing, so I guess they were mainly going off any production photographs or any photographs they could get their hands on, I suppose. And if you can't get photos to cover every angle, then I guess you are left to sort of blind interpretation, I suppose.
True. Good point.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, have you got anything else you want to mention from it?
Well, nothing major, I guess. To round off on, I was just going to ask you, because we sort of mentioned it already, but considering this is the launch of the Red Dwarf magazine, right? Would you, if you were in the editor position and for your comic slot, would you have gone in with an adaptation of the end to start with, or would you have wanted to kick off with an original comic adventure?
It's a tough one. I mean, I'm always more drawn as a reader to original adventures, so I guess my own bias there would probably drive me to want to be an original one. But I mean, I get the logic of starting with this just as a kind of introduction, and then you can, and as they do, go off into original stories fairly quickly. It makes sense, I guess.
I suppose I agree with that as well, but I think I'd go with you for original content, because I'm trying to think at this point, 1992, if you wanted to experience the end, the VHS tape was out.
Yeah, true.
I'm sure there were some repeats as well between series. You had Infinity Welcome's Careful Drivers, I think. Did that come out by 92, I think?
Yeah.
Was that a bit
so,
before?
yeah.
I can't remember. So, yeah, so do you know what I mean? You could rewatch the actual thing. You could read it. If this had been made in the early 70s, for example, when VHS wasn't a thing or repeats weren't often, or do you know what I mean? I would have got it more then. I sort of get it less in the early 90s, but like you say, I guess that it was mainly done for that introductory purpose for those who might have picked up the magazine solely out of intrigue or from the cover or from word of mouth or something. And actually, in the very first page, or is it after the comic? I'll just have a quick look. So just after the first comic, one of the articles in the magazine is literally a beginner's guide to Red Dwarf. So that sort of, I guess, reinforces our idea that, yes, this first issue especially was maybe targeted maybe a bit more so at those people who weren't as familiar with Red Dwarf as the Dyed-in-the-Wool fans, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. In which case it is a good thing to start with, I guess.
It is, and it advertises Red Dwarf t-shirts at the end, and to round off my thoughts, I love this
Red
little
Dwarf
bit.
t-shirts, do you say? That, we've got some of those,
we
do.
If you want to
buy them from our merch store, just saying.
And you know what? You don't have to tear off a little bit of the magazine, send it in the post and wait 8 to 12 weeks or whatever it used to be. I used to hate that in when you have to write on the card and it'd say, oh yeah, it takes 4 to 8 weeks or something like that. Oh, what a time that was.
Disliked the idea of that so much that I never did it.
I think I did it once, but I had to beg my pet because they were like, no, we're not doing this. I think I had to beg, and it took.
You had to send a check.
Yeah. Oh yes. Or if it was something really inexpensive, put 50p in your envelope and all that sort of stuff.
Check or a postal order.
A postal order. That's it. But I mean, my last little thing to close off on this, I love this little bit. It's at the end of issue 1. And every magazine has a little next issue blurb to sort of preview what's coming. And, it has the things like Robert Llewellyn interview, The End, Part 2, Arnold J. Rimmer's diaries, etc. And then the last little thing, it says, plus another brilliant next issue advert. And I thought, that's very Red Dwarf. I like that. I was like, that's good. So, yeah, I enjoyed it. It was nice to see The End adapted as a comic. It looks very nice. But yeah, I think like we said, ultimately, even though I'm the relative newbie, I don't think if I'd have picked this up now, right, if this had launched now, I think I would have honestly skimmed through it. Do you know what I mean? The comic part. As soon as I see it was just an adaptation of the end, I would have gone, all right, okay. I know what skim. Give me the articles, give me the interviews, give me all that sort of stuff. So if we touch on the comics again, like we said, I think we'll maybe dive into the original adventures.
Yes, absolutely.
What about you? What are your closing thoughts on what we've seen?
Yeah, I don't think it's not something that I would probably reread. It is I already know the story. If I want to revisit it, I'd probably go back to the episode. But the visuals, while being slightly too one hue, slightly too orange and red, are still nice, and it's nice seeing the expanded thing. And I guess the most interesting thing about it is the very small changes that they've made, like Rimmer being grey, holograms being grey in this world. That's kind of interesting.
That's good.
But other than that, I don't really massively see the point of it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the original comics hold instead. I think I'm much more interested in those.
Bring on the adventures of Mr. Flibble.
Yes, especially those. Yes, Mr. Flibble. I want to see the Scutters,
Ace Rimmer.
Ace Rimmer ones. Oh,
and androids, of course.
Of course, yes, and androids. I've actually just started watching Neighbours again for the first time in about 15 years because it's ending. So I'm like, well, I want to see Kylie come back in that final episode, and I want to understand what's going on around it. But I'm just going to watch the last few months of Neighbours.
Good idea.
So there we go. Do we want to give it a mark out of 10? We didn't discuss this before we started the episode, but
suppose not. I mean, as a comic, like forget as part of the magazine, if you like, as its own sort of thing, I'd probably give it a 7. Because I think, like, artistic, like, as I said, the way it's drawn is very good. The styling, like I said, is hit or miss, but the ones where it works, I think, really work. And as adaptations go, like, as I've said, if you wanted a faithful adaptation of the end, then there you go. So I think, as if they ever release, like, a Red Dwarf graphic novel that was, like, all of these comic stories
would be so good. Yes.
Yeah, if it was, like, all these comic stories in one book, I think I'd enjoy that more than as like part of a magazine, perhaps. But I'd give it a 7. Why not?
I would.
What about you?
Talking about that, I wonder where the rights lay for this now, because it was published by Fleetway, and I'm not sure if Fleetway still exists. Because
maybe not.
I know Fleetway from Sonic the Comic, which is a comic book that I used to collect when I was.
Wasn't that the longest running Sonic comic for a while, or am I thinking of a different? There was a Sonic comic that got an award for. That's it, the Archie,
the American Archie one, but this was the British Sonic the Comic, which ran in the 90s, and I used to collect as a kid, and that was by Fleetway. But I don't know if they still exist as a company or not, and if not, where?
Where does it default back? Because
where do the rights go to?
Because they must have got endorsement to some degree from the BBC and Grant Naylor to even do that. But I guess who does it mainly fall with? Does it fall to Grant Naylor? Does it fall to the BBC?
I don't know how the rights to the comic tie up with the rights to Red Dwarf generally and stuff, but Fleetway itself, apparently, according to the wiki, in August 2016, Rebellion Developments acquired Fleetway Library from Egmont, making it the owner of all comic characters and titles created by them. But so that's the iffy bit to that. In 2018, it was sold again, I think. Yeah, who knows?
It'll be one of them tricky rights limbos where either it belongs with does it belong with the new owner? Has it defaulted back to the Grant Naylor, the BBC? Is it a split thing? Who really knows? But if they ever did do a graphic novel which was all these comic stories comprised into one, I'd be interested in reading that.
Definitely. In terms of ranking, I think I would give it a 7 as well. Good art style generally. I like the way the characters are drawn and stuff. Holly, the sort of more angular Holly, I quite like, and things like that. And the expansive ship that you get to see a bit more of, and feel that it's a bigger, like the corridors feel bigger. Just feels like a huge ship, and that's really nice. Not so keen on the color palette, but I could live with it, I think. But it's still got held back a little bit by the fact that it's just the same story again. So
exactly.
But I mean, I'm not trying to take too much off of it for that, because as a media, as a comic itself, just looking at it completely as a comic itself, I think it's an interesting comic, and I think it works well as a comic. So yeah, 7 out of 10 as well. 7 scutters out of 10.
Excellent.
Well, there we go. If you want us to cover more of these, then tell us where to get hold of the scans.
Yes.
Basically.
Any cheap eBay lots?
We're particularly interested in those spin-off ones. I mean, we do want to see some of the just general original Red Dwarf things, but I definitely want to see that Scudder stories. I definitely want to see the Ace Roma stories. And a few others.
Mr. Flibble.
Mr. Flibble. Definitely want to see Mr. Flibble. So if you can point us in those directions, we'll be most appreciative.
Yes, please do. Please do.
We'll be back for another episode next week. I don't know what we're covering yet. We're flying by the seat of our pants at the moment,
We'll
frankly.
figure it out.
We're
if you've got any ideas for Red Dwarf content that's not the main TV show, then, feel free to leave them in the comments of the video or DM us on Twitter at the pod account, which is @AllDeadDavePod. So, yeah.
You never know. I might have finished reading the novel by then.
Maybe. Hey, we'll get to it at some point. Don't worry.
We will. Until then, thank you for watching. You can, of course, find us elsewhere on the internet.
Sure.
And Adam both have YouTube channels. Mine is Philip Hawkins. His is Adam Martyn, which is just our names.
Just our names.
And Twitter, we have the podcast Twitter account @AllDeadDavePod. I have a Twitter account which is @CultureFilter, filter being PHILTER. And what's your Twitter account, Adam?
Adam Martyn AMTV.
Come along and follow us on all of those.
Please do.
And we will see you next time.
Adios.
Bye-bye.